My name's Duncan Turner. I run an accelerator in Shenzhen, China called HAX. But we're basically a VC company that invests in very early stage technology companies. I see probably around 1,000 different startups applying to the program every year, and a heap of interesting creative and repetitive creative ideas. So kind of fascinated to hear how some of the other panelists think about different forms of creativity.
I'm David. I work at Dropbox as a design manager. I guess, as kind of leading teams that are building all kinds of stuff, I'm always interested in figuring out how to help them get more creative and so on. So I think that was why I was interested in the panel.
My name's Jack, and I run a graphic design studio called Motherbird in Melbourne. I was particularly interested in this topic. I did a talk here last year on ideas and creativity, so it's something that I'm really passionate about, digging out ideas. So hopefully you guys will learn a bit as well about my processes.
My name's Jess. I have a digital product design studio called Josephmark. We're based between Australia and the US. And I am speaking on Friday, and I'm speaking on innovation on Friday, and so I'm interested in the intersection of creativity and innovation and how they're the same and how they're different.
And welcome, everybody. I'm Diana Williams from Lucasfilm. We're going to start first with a video, I think.
Ideas are scary. They come into this world ugly and messy. Ideas are frightening because they threaten what is known. They are the natural-born enemy of the way things are. Yes, ideas are scary and messy and fragile. But under the proper care, they become something beautiful.
One day, machines will be sprayed to be made.
We can stop. Thank you. So, messy, ugly, and needing of nurturing. That pretty much describes ideas and creativity. So I want to start first with our wonderful panelists here. I want to discuss first the idea of creativity. It's been, right now, shifting a bit to primarily deal more with the arts, which I think kind of cheapens and lessens the idea of creativity, because there's creativity everywhere. I mean, I personally get super excited when someone gives me a great spreadsheet for how we're going to proceed in production. So I'd like to kind of get everybody's idea as to what they consider to be creativity. We can just go down the line. We'll start with you, Jess.
Creativity to me is about being elastic with your mind and letting yourself think, I guess, in multitudes of ways. I don't even think it's very cliche, but obviously everyone is creative. I don't think that you need to have an artistic talent or skill set in order to execute on your creativity. I think it's about the way you approach the world and people and ideas at the end of the day.
I probably agree with that. I firmly believe that anybody can be creative. I don't think it's limited to creative or artistic people. I do believe that artistic people are usually better at unlocking that creativity through reflection or through their own processes that they go through in life. I do believe that ideas come from your past experiences and how you're presently thinking. So when those two collide, that's when interesting things happen, creativity happens, and ideas happen. So obviously, all of the things that you've been through in the past, whether it's whether you've travelled or whether it's the way that someone's spoken to you, all of those things add up to you, and that makes you different. And the way that you're presently thinking is always shifting in time. So that's a way that your ideas also change over time, and your creativity changes over time, because you look at it in a different mind frame as you move along. I had an interesting conversation with Michael Beirut from Pentagram. I asked the question, can you teach creativity? And he said to me, oh, that age-old question. And I thought, oh shit, I've asked the wrong question. I'm an idiot, I've made a fool of myself. And he went on to say that he doesn't believe that he's creative at all. I think for me, the jury's still out. I'm not quite sure. I think he is creative in his own way. And the reason that I asked him that question is, if you guys know anything about him, he's really OCD, really process-driven, but he comes up with these really incredible ideas. So I do think it can come from all these different places, and it comes out of us in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, with the risk of just making everybody say the same thing, I guess I agree in many ways. Like, I think it's hard to define creativity in general. It's almost easier to define what it isn't than what it is, right? And as kind of my fellow panelists have said, it's definitely not a talent, meaning that, it's not something that you have or have not. I think that John Cleese described it really well. He described it as a mode of operating. And I think what he meant by that is that people that are creative, they aren't creative by themselves. It's not a talent, but they've just found a way. They learned a way to put themselves into the right frame of mind to come up with creative ideas. And he called this like the open mode. And to contrast that, there's the closed mode, which is what we're kind of in often in kind of regular day. The closed mode is about when you have deadlines, when you're trying to meet your targets, and that's a really challenging environment to be creative in. So I think it's a lot about getting into this open mode. So I think the interesting question is probably not like what is creativity, but how do you get to it? Like you have to be able to create the space where creativity can happen.
Sorry, I don't have a microphone. So for me, yeah, echoing what you guys said, definitely it can be learned for sure. I think I've seen that time and time again. For me, in like the line of work that I'm in, where it's all about technology, actually a lot of the times creativity is not necessarily coming up with something new. Right? It's about reappropriating some other technology and then finding a new way to take it to market, or potentially a problem for it to solve. A creative way of thinking about something, like taking influences you've had from somewhere else and then applying it to a new problem. I think sometimes people get a little bit intimidated by creativity because they feel like they have to come up with something original, but you really don't. It's kind of a means to just kind of prototype and kind of exchange ideas with people and then eventually get to something new. It was really fun to hear, all the exercise they did earlier when people were coming up with ideas. So the guy that was talking about the wristband, which measures your blood pressure and stress level and helps you to find Spotify tunes, who was that? That already exists. We invested in a startup doing that. And then Pillow Talk, the guy who was talking about Pillow Talk, that already exists, a company called Pillow Talk, a British company, believe it or not. They do almost exactly that. It's actually Scottish. But, it's fantastic just to kind of see how all these influences around us help us to come up with these kind of new ways of doing things and taking influences from different ways. That's kind of the way I see creativity working.
And that brainstorming session this morning was interesting because I walked around and I could see some people kind of stopping themselves, like either some people were more aggressive, and I'm not saying aggressive in a bad way, I'm saying aggressive in terms of getting their ideas out there. Other people then pulled back. Some people did stop and think, well, does that exist already? So we like to do things which we call blue sky meetings, and I feel like every company does the big blue sky meeting if they have an innovation part. What is hard, though, at times is trying to keep reality from seeping in. So I tend to, in our brainstorming sessions, I'll get excited, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, budgets. Like, we don't have an unlimited budget. But what do you feel is the best way in these types of blue sky meetings to kind of keep reality just out for a moment to allow people to continue to throw ideas and kind of keep that energy up?
I think my philosophy in life is where there's a will, there's a way. So, yes, absolutely, reality creeps in. I think even with the more constrained areas of a project, you can be creative. I think sometimes it's those constraints, actually maybe all the time, it's those constraints that actually force you to be even more creative with your solution. So I think that we shouldn't look at them as necessarily a bad thing in that sense.
I've probably got a bit of a different take on the idea of brainstorming. We certainly use it in our studio to generate a few early ideas, but I think a lot of the difficult things with brainstorming is we often put expectations on we have to come up with an idea, and then that ends up forcing an idea. So we'll often use it as an initial idea generation, and then we'll leave completely and let that idea fester. If you think about most of the time when you come up with ideas, it's never usually in those moments where you've got all that cognitive thought rushing around, where you've got emails, you've got clients calling, and you've got to be suddenly ready to brainstorm. It's hard to just be ready. There's a thing that I'm interested in called transient hypofrontality, and it sounds complex, but what it is transient meaning temporary, hypo meaning slow, and frontality meaning the frontal lobe of the brain. So it's basically your brain slowing down. And they used to think it was prevalent in people with schizophrenia and depression and all sorts of mental issues. And they've found more recently that anyone can access this by simply slowing the brain down. The brain usually works like a bit of a superhighway of thoughts, moving really quickly, and that'll happen when you are emailing people, when you're rushing around with deadlines and all of that sort of stuff. But when this sets in place and the brain slows down, the brain finds new connections to make, and they call it the meandering brain, so it thinks a bit differently, and the connections are made between different parts of the brain. And that's always the time when you're lying in bed at 12 at night trying to sleep and the brain's completely empty, you start coming up with ideas, or you're in the shower not thinking about the things that you have to think about. So we'll often use that brainstorming as an initial idea generation, and then not put any expectation on it, and let the idea, hopefully, if you've got time, let it fester for even a couple of weeks, and then it will sort of turn into something and snowball into something beautiful.
Yeah, I think like the intent of the Blue Sky meeting is good, right? Like you want to create this space where creativity can happen, kind of protected from a lot of the things that might kind of squash that. But I think often this like unconstrained, just brainstorming, which we kind of heard in the first exercise, right? Like it often just leads you kind of all over the place. And I think actually, to Jess's point, like great design thrives on constraints. So what I like to do with my teams is just to really embrace that and really understand the constraints deeply. And you try to together draw like the frame around the problem that you're trying to solve, right? And instead of going kind of all over the place, when you're brainstorming or when you're ideating, right, you kind of gently just bring back the discussion into that frame. But once you have the frame, you can, sometimes you're dealing with an over-constrained problem, and it can actually be hard to get out of it. And it can be helpful to kind of loosen some of those constraints, but it's easier when you have that frame of reference. One thing that we did at Dropbox, like recently, we were doing a design sprint and we were working on a new product, and we had these design principles that we come up with, and instead of just applying them to the domain that we were in, like productivity software, we actually decided to design for a completely different domain. So we used those design principles and designed a hotel experience and what that would look like. And kind of go out of that for a while and design for something completely different was helpful in terms of just coming up with new ideas. And then you can bring it back.
So I live in this weird world where we just can't do that. I wish we could. We actually need constraints, and like you're saying, Jess, it's like you can use creativity to kind of judge how well you're thinking about problem solving. Like when we have a technical issue or we have a technology where we're not really sure where the market is, we're never going to just sit there in a room without any stimulus and be like, aha, I've got it. You should change and do that. But what we do is we basically encourage the teams to constantly talk to other people from different backgrounds and then kind of push their idea to them and then get feedback from them and then sift through the crap that comes back, and then there'll be a little gem of wisdom, knowledge, or some kind of interesting idea that they can then take forwards. That's kind of how we get through those blunders.
Well, it's interesting in talking about constraints, and I mean, we also work on deadlines where something has to be out to market. So those are other things that kind of force the issue and kind of push you out of Blue Sky. But what are some other, because Blue Sky also, I find that people like to hear themselves talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. So at some point, something has to start to become real. And I felt like at times, the reason why people talk and talk as opposed to trying to put something into being is that putting something towards into being means that there is a chance of failure. So what I'd like to kind of jump into with all of you is this idea of like, how can we move out of Blue Sky and more into the iteration? Like, at what point do you realize we've been talking about this too much, we've got to start to move out? And we're going to start with you, Duncan.
Okay. So I guess kind of two approaches to this. The first one is when you're brainstorming, right? So I used to work at a company called IDEO, which probably a lot of you here know is like a creative agency that has this brainstorming philosophy and process, which is quite interesting. And they've got a number of rules. The first one is always build on someone's idea. What that basically means is don't make someone feel shitty about a bad idea. That's a really nice kind of little thing to put into any kind of brainstorming situation, because it means everybody's constantly building and kind of moving on things and iterating. Another thing that we always say is don't write down what you're saying, actually draw a picture. And then the reason for that is it can then be misinterpreted by someone else who will then come up with an interesting idea on top of that. That's some nice kind of immediate ways to kind of get fast iteration of ideas. And then just prototype them as quickly as you can. That's something that we really encourage at Hacks. The teams come in and basically we want them to do weekly prototype iterations of their hardware. So they can make things as terrible in terms of quality as they want, because a prototype is there just to answer a question, right? So it should be as high enough fidelity to answer a question that you're trying to ask. Is this the right size? Is this the right shape? Would this fit into someone's house here? Could somebody put this in their pocket? Could they use this interface, etc.? And I think for us, we just kind of try and get people to get out into the real world as soon as possible and not hold themselves up with all these ideas and then just execute on one and get married to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think like deeply like understanding your users and empathizing with them is like the best way to kind of get out of your head sometimes. And like there's nothing more humbling to like when you're thinking about something big and then you go and watch some users try and like do the most basic things in your product and they completely fail, and like you're like, okay, we got to, like there's a lot of stuff that we got to get out and figure out. So I mean, I think in terms of the Blue Sky meeting, and I'll give an example that kind of worked well for us, was that so our VP of product, Todd Jackson, we did this one like Blue Sky meeting, and he told all of us to like the entry ticket for the meeting was to draw out your ideas on kind of paper to sketch them out, and that was the way you would get into the meeting. And that was just helpful because it basically gave everybody the agency to draw something. It kind of set the stage for having like the same fidelity, so everybody could participate, not only designers, and that was a really nice way of getting to kind of concreteness.
I've only ever worked in really small teams, in small studios, who usually know each other quite well. So the idea of being able to be quite honest with people is always really important. So in our studio, if an idea is shit, then you'll know pretty quickly. And I think that's also important. Obviously, you have to manage people's personalities and their feelings and whatnot in bigger studios, because you just don't want to burn through staff. But at the same time, it's fantastic being able to go into these meetings in small teams and be as brutal as possible, because you end up really evolving an idea and turning it into something quite quickly when you can be that honest. I think in terms of coming out of it, it's important to start it with objectives. So obviously things that you've got to tick off, and once you start ticking those off, then you can sort of go, okay, this idea is actually turning into what we need it to turn into.
I don't know if as a general rule, brainstorming works for everyone. And I'm going to be maybe a little controversial saying that I support prototyping frequently and as quickly as possible, but I'm not sure. I worry whether sticking to one methodology and repeating that is actually going to get the best outcome overall. And I've worked with a lot of different creative people, and there's a spectrum of personality, and not everyone's willing to share their ideas out loud. And obviously that comes down to trust in a lot of ways, but it also comes down to the way that people naturally express themselves. And so I think it's important to have multiple methodologies or ways of approaching this. And it's really up to the individual to understand themselves and how they get to a level of fidelity with their idea and then how they express that. It's an interesting topic because I think we naturally want to make sense of things and we want to put process around things, but then inherently creativity is about experimentation, and then when you add a commercial layer to that, that's where this concept becomes quite the paradox.
But then a commercial layer always has to come up at some point because none of us are .orgs. So I think that discussion, I think when we bring that in, it kind of gets back to the idea of like how much we can change and morph with each idea of like what is creativity and how can we foster it. Because there are people, as you said, like I work with a lot of people who just throw ideas up. If you can like picture like there's just words all over the place. And then I have people who just kind of can walk through the cloud of words and just pick out the better ideas to try to formulate and figure out what is something we can move forward on. So then in that, like in looking at how you're forming the teams and how you're trying to foster the idea of creativity and foster the idea of like how people get ideas out there for the betterment of themselves as well as their own kind of career trajectory, what needs to get done in the company. We all know that a happy employee is also brings the best creativity and innovation to the company. So what are some interesting ways in which to foster that kind of teamwork?
I think it does all come down to trust. I think it also comes down to purpose. Happiness is an interesting one because I think, I don't know, creative people are on a spectrum.
Yeah.
I think that I think it's about having an awareness of the culture that you're creating, and it's about relationships at the end of the day that you have with your team and that your team has with anyone else involved in the project.
I think you're certainly right with having a balance of people in there. So if someone is throwing out a whole lot of ideas, if the second person's throwing a lot of ideas out as well and no one can quite make sense of them, you need someone in there that can distill all of that information and come in and go, okay, like you said, this works with this, but that's not going to work. And then you sort of work as a team that way. I've started a business with two people that I went to high school with. So we've always sort of worked together. And as you work over several years, you learn to develop certain skill sets, and certain people get stronger at the creative stuff, and certain people get stronger at the analytical stuff. So I think the strongest teams are a mix of all of those sorts of people. You don't want a room full of just creative people. I know we're on the topic of creative, and creativity is anything, but you don't want those people that are just throwing out hundreds of ideas as opposed to the people that can actually analyze them.
Yeah, I second that. I think like having people with different, because often creativity or kind of getting it out is around like having different ways, different frameworks for looking at a problem and kind of come up with things. So kind of having interdisciplinary teams, not just multidisciplinary, but interdisciplinary, where actually like everyone in your team has both understanding in their own discipline and deep knowledge there, but also can perform the aspects of another discipline is super important to kind of get that and get have understanding and come to interesting new ideas and get them moving forward.
Yeah, just second that. Like, if you've got an interdisciplinary team, showing the people who are not necessarily classed as creatives that actually they've done something creative and applauding that is really important. Like, I've lost count a number of times that, you have somebody who's like an accountant in the room who really doesn't know why they're there, and then suddenly everyone realizes actually they came up with a fantastic strategy just because they look at things in a completely different way. And, there's a famous book called Creative Confidence, which is basically all about this exact notion of everybody's got this ability to be creative, they just need a confidence around it. And so you just need to find a way to make sure that everyone in your staff feels like they've got an outlet for it and that their type of creativity is being applauded.
So now back to the actual title of the session, Creativity and Technology. So technology was technically supposed to make our lives easier, though I'm completely addicted to my phone, addicted to my calendar, addicted to my task list, everything. So I don't know so much about the easier part, but in terms of what we're all trying to do, striving to go forward in innovation, how do you see technology fitting into that? How can technology help to bring out the creative in people and in terms of strategy? Because it's all great and fine, as we're pointing out, to have all these ideas, but at some point these ideas have to become strategy and or product or whatever your end goal is. I'll start with you. I'm going to mix it up.
Start in the middle. I firmly believe that sitting at a computer is doing, not thinking. And until tech comes around where computers are doing creative thought, it relies on us to be doing it. There's, in the graphic design industry, and I know, interior design, animation, motion, all of that sort of stuff, there's so much inspiration out there on our tech. We're all sharing nice pictures of houses, we're all sharing nice pictures of people's work, and it's somehow become homogenized because we're on these devices all the time looking at everyone else's stuff, and it seeps into our own work. And recently we rebranded a digital agency in Melbourne, and they wanted a bit of a different approach. The boss had sort of been to a talk and he'd seen people doing things differently, and he said, I want you to do this completely differently. So we thought, well, let's go back to how people used to do things in pre-computer times. So we brainstormed by hand. Now that's not new, you often do that in your studio yourself anyway. But then we also conceptualized it by hand. We came up with the ideas, the iterations, everything by hand on butcher's paper, and left the computers alone. But then we also presented them by hand. So we presented on big sheets of butcher's paper, and the only piece of technology was a Sharpie pen. Now my drawing skills are not very good. So it relied on the idea to be absolutely paramount. And what that enabled us to do was really come up with an idea that we saw value in. We couldn't present it to a client like you usually would with, it on a billboard, which it'll never be on a billboard, and they go, wow, this is fantastic. Or, on a smartphone or a smartwatch or whatever it is, and you gloss it over with these beautiful digital sort of templates. So the way that we presented it, it really showed the bones of the idea, and it really had to be strong. And it was something that it was so well received that we've started to implement that into our processes. You do need a client that is visual in a way and can understand where something might go. A lot of clients don't understand that, and they need to see things almost as finished pieces for them to be able to understand it and you to articulate it. So you do need to pick the right person to do this to, and we did, and it turned out quite well.
So I think the thing with, there's a lot of, as kind of a designer of productivity tools, this is something I think about a lot, obviously, and Dropbox is used by a lot of designers and the like. So and there's actually a lot of products out there, kind of marketing, hey, let's get more efficient, do more, check more boxes every day. And the interesting thing is that in our research we found that the most productive and the most successful teams actually don't care that much about efficiency. They care much more about things like quality of their work, whether or not it has a tangible impact, and if it has a larger purpose in the world. And I think a lot of the products out there are kind of not really enabling that. So the way we think about it is that we want to design like left brain products for right brain people. You know, I work on paper specifically from Dropbox, and one thing, you know, one way that we're trying to think about it is that like a lot of products out there are trying to get you into like a certain workflow, like, you know, follow a way of working, and we're trying to make paper be both like simple and flexible at the same time, and I think that is something that is a design principle for creative tools that is successful. Creative, like you want to be working in your own way. You don't want to be forced into a specific way of working.
So my industry is basically only exists because of creativity on technology. It's kind of interesting. Like the whole hardware world has completely exploded over the past 4 years, basically because of makers that democratize know-how of how to do things, and then a certain number of technological breakthroughs, like 3D printers, Arduinos, which is like an open source microcontroller, Raspberry Pi, which is a microprocessor, and a bunch of other kind of basically building blocks, which enable people to not get stuck down kind of learning how to do electrical engineering because they've come up with this great idea of a pillow which talks to your lover, but actually they can just go and get the bits, put them together, and then test the real value to the consumers. And it's actually, you know, it's weird. It's kind of become a complete marketplace in itself. Like prototyping tools for hardware companies is a huge market. It's kind of, you know, we've done 5 investments in the space now, and they're all kind of raising millions and millions of dollars on the simple fact that everybody's kind of becoming more creative with the types of new different hardware that they create, and they need tools to do it. I mean, I'm not trained as an electrical engineer, I'm trained as an industrial designer, but I've got a bunch of tools now that I can pull together, and suddenly I've created an interactive object. That's kind of actually a fascinating breakthrough for the world that we live in. But I understand it's very unique to us as well.
Yeah, I think that technology has greatly improved the way that I work and the way that I design and the way that I communicate. I rely on my phone way too much. I don't like the addiction that I have to that. I don't get a pen and paper out nearly enough anymore. My drawing skills have gone down the drain because of that. I know that people are concerned that we're not going to be able to handwrite in, you know, maybe as little as 10 years, at least with our younger generation. But I think the goals that you have with paper and about using technology to make a flexible environment, and what I would like to see is more tools that do allow you to influence how you use them. I'm sick of project management software that makes me use the management system that they've come up with rather than being able to define my own. So I think that is going to happen. I think that's close. And I think, I don't know, this is kind of a side thought, sorry to go on a tangent, but I have noticed that, you know, a lot of my peers in different creative disciplines, I feel like I'm going back on my words here, have really been hungering for the natural world more and more. So something I've done in my personal life is I now have a farm and I grow organic vegetables, and that's a completely different business to the one that I run every day. And I've just seen this trend with photographer friends of mine and animators and people that are really consumed by a digital environment wanting to connect with the natural world. But I can see that becoming more and more of an interplay, and maybe that is where AR will start to really find a place as well.
That's actually a great segue into this quote I want to bring up, and I'm going to read, and I don't have my glasses, so we'll see how this actually goes. Adam Penberg, author of Play at Work, How Games Inspire Breakthrough Thinking, in an article in Forbes said, because games offer clearly articulated rewards for each point players score and new level they achieve, they trigger the release of dopamine, a hormone in the brain that encourages us to explore and try new things. Since we like the feeling we get when our brains are awash in it, we'll do whatever it takes to get it over and over. I'm a challenge junkie. And I'm lucky that I work in a company of challenge junkies. We're always trying to figure out how we can better ourselves and better what we're trying to do, whether we're talking story or technology. And you bring up a great point that you've kind of gotten out of your head in terms of looking at what you're doing with your farm. So what are some other ways in which we can always keep the dopamine going? That's not what we're doing in our daily lives.
Yeah, well, for me, it's driving an hour and a half up the coast every Friday night, and literally getting my hands dirty, and yeah, learning about permaculture and growing food from scratch that I then cook is an extremely delightful experience that, yeah, I wasn't expecting.
It's something that's difficult to keep going at times when, you're working so rapidly in this world. For me, it's about, I try and get out of my own head as much as possible, and try and get away from the studio and try and do things. I don't have a farm, unfortunately, but that sounds fantastic. But trying to explore new things and learn new things and challenge myself in ways that I haven't been challenged before, and that usually generates a new love for what I'm doing, I think.
I guess, I agree, I guess. I'm trying to get inspired, I guess that's the question, right? I like to look at different creative disciplines and how they work, and because it's often similar, but it's also different. I like to hear comedians, for example. I think they're very interesting to listen to, and how they come up with new material, and obviously have a creative process that's wildly different from what I do in terms of domain, but still has a similar output. And I get inspired by looking at other disciplines, if it's gaming or movie making or something else that's different from making a productivity tool.
Yeah, for me, it's very simple. It's just kind of trying to go back to what I actually am, which is at heart a designer originally, and kind of trying to take some of those learnings that I had and used to practice a long time ago, and then applying that to what I now do, which is look at technology and how it interacts with people. That's kind of what I try and do. It's kind of a strange process, but I sort of go back to some of my old projects and oh yeah, I remember thinking about that, and it kind of just shifts your brain a little bit away from parallel thinking about what kind of new technology is coming and how you're going to get it into the world.
And thanks, guys. Thank you so much. I think there was some really amazing insights there. The brain breakdown. I think we've all been in the shower, or and get your best ideas just when you're meant to be going to sleep, and suddenly I've got to write something down. Being creative is about putting yourself in the right mode. I thought that was really interesting as well in the discussion there. Just in terms of, it's also important to do different techniques, because not everybody responds to those kind of collaborative, everybody have all your ideas, but build on each other's ideas versus shit all over them was fantastic. And often the technique we always use is, instead of but, and, yes and. Drawing versus just writing, fantastic as well. And again, getting out there and testing these things as soon as possible versus being married to the one thing and just running. Thank you so much, panellists, for this morning. If you come down, we'll go into the next. We're basically going to break shortly. If we could have a round of applause for our panellists here.